So now that we have duplicated the same functionality in Composition API, let's now talk about Composables. What are Composables? Composables basically allows you to remove functionality from the component itself. Yes, you heard it right. You can remove functionality from the component, meaning your component contains only the template and its functionality can be detached from it. Meaning, for example, you have 5 components, let's say 5 components, and then they all use the same functionalities. You can now detach that specific functionality into a separate file and then use that file in those 5 components. Get it? Meaning, you can now reuse functionalities, or rather, not just functionalities, but you can reuse certain types of code into useful composables. Meaning, they can be imported in any component at any point in time. So, it's much better to demonstrate instead because it's just, in our case, it's a really beautiful feature because you have, for example, 5 components and then they're using the same functionality. So you have duplicate code, or rather, we're suffering from duplicate code. So instead of, Instead of duplicating that code, we now have the capability to detach that specific functionality into a separate file and then simply import them to those components that need those types of functionalities. So let's just head to the demonstration in order to see the difference. So again, we're going to duplicate the exact same functionality, but this time we're going to use Composables. So let's just grab the this template right here. So we're going to duplicate the exact same template. So it's going to need some functionality. So we're still going to retain the same setup, but the key difference here is instead of coding the functionality inside the setup, we're going to code the functionality in a different file. So here you can see I have prepared a to-do list file. So this is a file that is separate from the component itself, which is right here. So in this case, we're going to create the functionality. So first, let's import the ref. We're going to need the ref definitely because we're going to create a variable, right? So next, we're going to declare now the to-do list. So let's have a ref, which is an empty array. Okay. Next, we're going to export the exact value, which is to-do list. What did we do here? So what we did here is basically we created a variable inside the JavaScript, and then that variable is exported. So if you'll notice, it behaves similarly to the return function in the setup. So thinking of it as a setup function, you can now kind of guess what happens here as well. So what's basically going to happen here is we're going to create the functionality inside here, and then we're going to export those functionality, we're going to export them below here. And then since they're exported, what we're going to do is we're going to import them here in the component. So first, let's focus on the functionality. Again, now that we have the to-do list, let's add the function. So add to-do list. To-do list is a function, and then it's going to have an input as a parameter. And then let's just use the same principle, to-do list, that value, that push, again the input. And then we're going to export that exact functionality, like so. And then we're going to create the remove functionality as well. Remove to-do list. So let's say index. Similar to, or rather completely the same as before. So to-do list, the value that splice, we're going to use the index, and then let's set this one to 1. And then we're going to export that functionality again. So as you can see, we now have an add to-do list, a remove to-do list, and then we have a to-do list. But where's the input? Where's the input going to reside, right? Actually, we don't need that anymore because as you can see, the add to-do list has a parameter of an input. So since we have this functionality exported, we don't need to store anymore that value. We simply need to call the function, and then that function is going to update our to-do list. Now, In this to-do list, we're going to create something kind of something really useful in terms of functionality, which is called read-only. So what does read-only mean? What it means is list input, something like that. What it means is you can convert a variable into a read-only state, meaning you cannot modify that data at all. Hence the word read-only. So in this case, we're going to convert the to-do list into a read-only variable. So let's have a to-do list and then let's bind the read-only, which is the input list. In this case, instead of modifying the to-do list, we're going to modify the input list, which is this one. So it's back to normal again. And then we're going to export the read-only version of that variable. So you can see the difference, right? So breaking this down, or rather talking more about this one, what we did is we created a variable, which is the input list, right? And then we created another version of that variable, which is a pointer in a sense, named to-do list. And then the read-only version of that variable is what we're going to expose, hence the export. Next, we created two functions, right? We have an add to-do list and then remove to-do list. So these two functionalities serves as the only way to modify the input list, because there's no way for them to access this variable in the first place because it is not exported. So since it is not accessible from the outside, we created now a function that is a file that is self-sustaining, meaning it can only modify itself and there's no way for others to modify it. So if you take a look at it from another perspective, you can basically create now your own data store. Or in other words, you can create your own VUEx store. So that is one of the most beautiful features of the Composition API, because not only can you create now your own version of data stores, you can also specify which is which. In this case, we can only select certain values. So in the case of VUEx, yes, you can mutate values using mutations only, right? In this case, we can also do that. So in this case, this function is somewhat a mutation, because what it does is it modifies the value of the variable, and there's no way to modify this value at all because it is not exported. So if you take a look at this one, the to-do list is akin to a getter. So now that we have this one, we can try and implementing this composable rather. So now that we have this composable up and running, what we're going to do now is we're going to import those functionalities. So import let's import the to-do list, okay, the add to-do list, and then remove to-do list. So now that we have them imported in the file, we can now use them in our setup function. So first, let's add the to-do list. And then let's add the to-do list and then remove to-do list. So as you can see, we now have the same functionality bound to the same template. Last but not least, we now need the input for the template. So let's create the input here. So let to-do list input ref, and then let's set this one to null. Again, if we're going to use ref, we're going to need to import it from view. Like that. And then we're going to return this one. So to-do list input. There we go. So this time, the expected output is if I type here, it's going to add an item. Like that. Oh, sorry, my mouse is double clicking. But if I click the X button, it's going to remove the item. It works flawlessly. So let's talk about the composables. Let's talk more about the composables. So, because the composables is a really nice feature of the Composition API. So, if we go back here, as you can see, we have a composable, right? We have a file that is self-sustaining, meaning it has its own container, it has its own variable that contains its supposed values, it also has its way of changing those values, which is the add to-do list and then the remove to-do list. And it also has its way of giving that specific value to other components, which is the read-only version of the input list, which is this one. Now, since this file is a composable, basically you can use it on other components, right? So here what we did was we imported that specific component, or rather that specific composable in the component, meaning the component is accessing the values of that composable. So in this case, we simply use the to-do list, add to-do list, and the remove to-do list from the composables, which is the file right here. And then, since we imported those functionalities, in order for the component to use them, we simply copy these values here and we return them as is. Meaning the template is going to use those exact functionalities from the composable. Meaning the functionality is not inside the setup function anymore, but rather it is inside the composable. So in a sense, you can kind of get the picture that you can create a series of composables which contains all of your data and then simply import them to your components to be accessed at any point in time. So we can try doing that. So I actually haven't tried that one yet. So let's create another component here. So let's create a view component. Let's say to-do list, composables 2. So something like that. Okay, let's just click that. So we're going to create a carbon copy of this one. So let's just copy it here. But let's add the number 2 to differentiate between the two. And then let's add the value again here. So in this case, we now have two components, right? There are two components that access the same composable. So we're going to import this in our component. So let's add another div and then let's import to do these composables 2. So now we're going to have another version of the component, which is the second version. So if I type here test, as you can see, the composition, or rather, the second component updated its values as well. So if I click this X button here, it removes it as well. So now you can see the difference, right? So it's very beautiful actually if you take a look at it. So if I modify here in the second version, the first version updates as well. And then if I click let's say remove the item from the second version, it behaves similarly as well. So let's add the value here and then remove it from the second value, or rather the second component, it's going to remove that as well. So now you can see the beauty of composables. Basically, with composables, you are now able to create your very own data store. So in a sense, what do you call this? It's somewhat akin to VUEx in its in its implementation. So you can basically create your own VUEx store if you get the idea, right? So in a sense, or rather to to compare it to a VUEx store, the input list here is considered the store, right? This is the store values. And this one is considered a getter. Here you have the mutators. This is the mutators right here. And in case you want to create actions, you can also do that. So it's possible as well. So you can simply create another function which calls another function inside this one and then expose that specific function and not the other one. Meaning the mutation is only inside the file and not outside. So in this case, what we did is we created a mutator directly. So the function that changes the values themselves is exposed directly. So in the case of larger applications, for example, you want to create multiple server requests, it is possible to create an action instead by, let's add a function one here. Fetch data, for example. So you have this function here, and then it's a, let's say, it's a promise. Let's say resolve, reject, and then something like that. Okay. Oh. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Turn new promise, I think. Yes. There we go. So in this case, let's say fetch data. And then once the data is fetched, you simply resolve. Then let's say true. Let's say something like that. So basically, that's how it works. So let's say reject false. So something like that. And then we're going to return the fetch data. So if you, or as you can see, this is the equivalent of the action. So let's say you want to modify the data here, so you can simply add to do this here, for example. And then you can, let's say, something like that. So the fetch data is exposed and the add to do list is here. So for example, let's comment this out. So now you can see that only the fetch data is accessible, right? And then since only the fetch data is accessible, you can see that these two functions here is now considered a mutator because they are the only ones who can modify the value here. And the only way to access this mutation here is through this function. In a sense, you can basically now create your own VUEx data store. Or rather, you can skip the VUEx part and simply roll out your own implementation. But for those of you who are, let's say, not aware yet of what VUEx is, or the, what do you call this, the VUEx functionality, you can refer to our other video which tackles that specific topic. But in a nutshell, VUEx allows you to maintain a certain state of truthfulness in your data, meaning it allows you to modify data wherever you are on a component. So with Composables, that specific functionality is achieved as well. So here, you can see that we basically created our own data store. And then what happens is, wherever you import that specific composable, whenever changes happen to it, it's reacting across all components. Meaning, again, based on the demonstration, if I add a value here, as you can see, the second component also updates itself because they're basically pointing to the same composable. Since they're pointing to the same composable, whatever changes happen to that composable, it also gets reflected to the other components. Meaning, you now have a centralized data store. So you don't have to worry that much anymore about duplicate functionalities as well as repetitive code because you simply need to code once. Meaning you're going to code your composable, which is going to contain your data, and then you're going to bind them to any component that you wish to use that composable. That is one of the beauties of the Composable API. Let's dive a little bit deeper regarding the composition. Remember in options, we have the mounted, right? Like this. We have the mounted. And, oh, I'm sorry. I think it messed up. So, mounted. Remember this, right? So, in the mounted, basically, whatever you code inside the mounted is run after the DOM is loaded, right? So, there are certain instances that you would want to do just that. So, let's say alert. Hello. Something like that. So, it alerts as well, right? So, oh, sorry. So, okay. Oh, okay. So that is the options API counterpart. But in composition, in case I wanted to create a functionality inside a mounted, how do I go about doing that? Well, you can do just that by simply creating a mounted. Since we have the onMounted hook, we can create that, or rather, we can now implement a mounted feature inside a composition. So onMounted, we're going to create a function which is hook. In this case, the first parameter of the function onMounted is a hook, meaning it's a function that it's going to run. Let's say alert. I am a hook. Something like that. So as you can see, we replicated the exact same functionality. Oh, okay, it reloaded several times. I'm sorry. So, in case of compositions, there's a certain caveat, especially in mounted, right? There are certain situations, especially in our case, there are so many situations wherein we're going to manipulate certain variables in the mounted area, but since the DOM is much faster than the mounted, we always encounter the specific error, which is the undefined error. How do you counter such type of problem, right? So what happens is we manipulate the variable, and then the variable itself is not yet initialized since it is mounted, right? So if we're going to modify the mounted, and then by the time the data arrives, we expect it to have some sort of length. So in our case, there are certain data type errors because what happens is the DOM is always faster than the function. So in this case, it's a huge help because what happens is you can create your own mounted hooks way before the DOM even renders, right? Remember, the setup function is the equivalent of the before created and the created hook inside the options API. So in the options API, we have these certain hooks, right? Before create, something like this. Meaning, you can code certain types of functionalities before the actual component is rendered. And then you also have the created. Meaning, you can run certain types of functionalities, or you can run code after the component is created. But remember, created is not equal to mounted, because mounted means that the DOM itself is already present and the data is already bound. So in this case, the setup function itself is the created and the before mount already. So you don't have to create those hooks inside here anymore. So it doesn't work that way because the setup function itself is the created already. So the setup function runs all of these functionalities before the DOM even renders. So in this case, let's say since the unmounted is controlled by you, in this case we have this unmounted right here, we don't have to worry about data consistency anymore because in this case, let's say let's declare a variable here. So let's say number is equals to f. Let's start this one from 0. And then unmounted, I want to alert that number. And then I want the number to increment, or rather number that value plus plus. So there you go. What happens is if we reload this one, it's going to have the value of 1, right? So as you can see in the setup function, you don't have to necessarily worry about variable declaration that much anymore. So to demonstrate, we can put this one way up here and it would still work, which is kind of weird, right? If you take a look at it, you have the unmounted hook here and then you have the number here, and yet it still resolves to the same variable, which is kind of weird. But it works, meaning you can restructure your code any way at all in the setup function, meaning it's much more flexible in terms of structuring your code, which is very useful for enterprise applications. So in this case, let's move this down here. It works the same as well. So in our case, one rule of thumb that we have is the hooks that we have is coded below. You might ask why below, because if we put the unmounted on the top of the code, it confuses us because we reference variables that are in the first place not yet declared. Or rather, in our case, if you take a look at this one, if we move the value here, the number is confusing because what value, or rather, what is this variable pointing to? Well, it means it's this one. So the way it works, it works because the unmounted hook is not called upon initialization right here. What the setup function does is it creates a hook, meaning it's going to run this mounted function after the setup returns. So by the time the setup returns, the variable is already ready for usage, or rather for consumption. So it works basically anywhere anywhere you'd like to put it. So in our case, for more code clarity, we just put it on the bottom section to make things much more clean, meaning we're going to reference the number which is declared up here, just to make things much more simpler. So aside from mounted, you also have watchers, right? You're going to ask, how about watchers? So in this case, in the options API, we have the watch, right? We have the watch object, and then we declare a variable name here to do this input, and then we set it as a function, something like that, right? And then we set this new value, and then old value. Okay, let's remove this alert for now. It confuses people, or it's kind of confusing. Okay, so now that we have that, okay, so it's not used. So let's remove the old value. So alert. My value is something like this. And then new value. Okay, new value. So yeah, so that is how we create watchers, right? So if I type A and then type something here, as you can see, we have a watcher, right? So that's how watchers work on the options API. So how about composition? Well, it works basically still the same, but a little bit different. So in composition API, if you want to declare a watcher, you're going to add a watch here. So meaning we're going to import the watch function from Vue, and in order to create a watcher for a variable, now look, here's the much more better part of the watcher. You can initialize your watcher wherever you want, right? Since it's the setup function. So in this case, we're going to bind the number right beside the watcher. So I want you to watch the number variable, and then you're going to do this when it changes. If it changes, I want you to alert the value of the watcher or the new value. My new value is new value. Something like that. Okay, so 1. So let's remove this one here, or maybe let's just keep it, let's just leave it there for reference purposes. And here you have the new watcher, right? So if I type A, it's going to supposedly, what do you call this? Not this one. Oh, we were watching the number. Oh, I'm sorry. So, since we're watching the number, let's watch the to-do list input. Oh, no. Okay, so let's move this one here. Let's say here. Let's keep them together. So something like that. So that's the beauty of the composition API. You can group together certain functionalities. So in this case, if I type A here, it's going to alert. And then if I type B here, it's going to alert, right? Meaning, this function, meaning this function right here, is run every time the to-do list input is modified, hence the watch. So basically, that's how you create a watcher in the composition API sense. First, you pass the variable that you wish to watch, and then you add a function to it, which will run every time the value changes. So in this case, let's remove the B, it's going to fire again. So that is how you create watchers inside, what do you call this? That is how you declare watchers inside the composition API. So aside from watchers, you also have computed properties, right? So in the case of options, in order to create computed properties, what we usually do is we create computed, right? And then let's say total items, for example. And then what we're going to do is we're going to return, or rather, this to-do list, that length. Yes. Meaning, it's going to run this, or it's going to count for the length of the array every time we change it. Then return. I think it's supposed to be a function. If I'm not mistaken, I know it's a function supposedly. Yes, something like that. Okay, there you go. So I'm sorry. So let's add here a certain div. Oh, no. Let's say before. Let's say span total items, and then let's add the total items. So something like that. Okay, let's wrap this one in a div to make things much more neat. Okay, and then let's put this here. Okay, and then let's adjust this one. There you go. Okay, so let's say if I add an item here, you have the total items 1, right? Meaning it computed the specific value. And then if I add another item, it now refers to 2, right? And if I remove 1, it's going to count back to 1. So that is how you basically create a computed property in the options API, right? So how about the composition version? So in the composition version, you simply need to import the computed. And then inside the computed, or rather, in order to create a computed property, we're going to create another variable. Or maybe you can do that directly here as well. There are 2 ways to go about that. So let's say total items. Let's say it's a computed. It's going to use the to-do list that value that length. So there you go. Let's see. I think no, it's not supposed to be this way. Okay, so I think I forgot how to use that. So anyway, we're going to just declare it right here. So let total items and then computed. I want you to compute the to-do list. I think it's a function, if I'm correct. Ah, yes, it's a function. Okay, so my bad. So return to-do list that value that length. Yes. And then we're going to return the total items here. Something like that. And then next, we're going to display that total items here. So we're just going to copy this one. And then let's put this here. So if I add an, the watcher is firing. Okay, let's comment this one. Let's just comment the watcher for now. So if okay, let's remove the watch for now. Okay, maybe not. You can use the watch and comment the alert instead. Okay, there you go. It's a new value plus something like that. Oh no, it's a string. Okay, so let's say console.log instead of alert. Console.log. Okay, there you go. So what happens is if I add an item here, it's going to update the computed value as well. So if I add another item, it's going to update that as well. So as you can see, they behave completely the same. So if I add an item here, it adds as well. So they actually behave similarly if you take a look. So here's our computed property, right? It's a function. So its purpose is to return the to-do list that length. In the composition, we did the exact same one as well. So we created a total items, which is a computed property, which contains again a function, and then its purpose is to return the length of the to-do list variable, right? So I mentioned this earlier that there is also another way of declaring a computed property, right? You can declare them actually here directly too as well. So in this case, let's add a computed here, and then let's add a function here, and then it's going to return the value, which is to-do list that value that length. Something like that. So it behaves similarly as well. So let's just remove this one here, and maybe let's comment it out. Okay, so if you take a look, they behave exactly the same as that. So there's not much of a difference. So there are 2 ways in declaring computed properties in Composition API. Either you declare them here, below, or you declare them up here, which is something like this. So in my case, I prefer this one here because it clarifies the purpose of the variable. Also, it keeps the return statement below kind of, need. So that is one of the ways of, that is the example of creating a computed property in Vue. Thank you guys for watching this tutorial video. I hope you have learned something from it as well as gained some new insights regarding the Composition API. If you have any further questions or further clarifications, please don't hesitate to ask us in the comments section below. If you like what you're seeing or if you have learned something from these tutorial videos, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button to get notified of our latest updates as well as whenever we upload new tutorial videos. Again, this is Joshua from Pixelate. See you later, Pixelators!